Dangerously Incompetent here with more Weakspots in World of Tanks. This episode, the T-10 Soviet Tier 9 heavy tank. I was bimbling about in my S6 today and I came across a couple of these in the enemy team. And looking at the roster I saw T-10. I don't recognise that designation, wonder what that is. Then I ran up against them and thought, oh, that looks awfully familiar. Soviet Tier 9 heavy tank with a pike nose, long gun. Oh, it's probably is that one of a new clan reward tank or something? Oh, then I had a look around and oh, it's an S8, rebadged and probably jiggled around a little bit. So that's a good reason to look at its armour. Now the first thing to notice about the S8's armour, is T10's armour, is compared to other Tier 9 heavy tanks, it's quite thin. Let's have a look at the front. 120. Don't worry about the equivalent for the moment. Just the 120 on the front. Let's have a look on the side. 120. So, if we have a quick look at the E75, which admittedly is a well-armoured, or thickly armoured Tier 9. It's got 120 on the side. Remember the T10 had 120 on the front, and on the front 160. So thickness wise the T10 quite thin for a Tier 9 heavy at any rate. But all is not lost. It has the pike nose, which as you can see is quite heavily angled. It's angled front to back, and then how do we look at, there we go. It's also angled coming on onto the side, which ends up giving you some quite sharp angling, which gives you ricocheting and of course very thick equivalent armour. I never seem to get along too well with these pike noses because you've got either pointing directly to get the equivalent and the ricochets, you've got to point straight at the enemy. And if they're of high enough tier, their guns can penetrate anyway. And if you try giving them the side, if you get it a little bit wrong, you've ended up giving them this thinner armour and you've knocked out one of the anglings. So it's not very thick at all. 140, wow, that's looking from above. 187 is not so great. And when big tank, tall tanks, or tanks on hill start looking down on you, that cheek is awful thin for 131. So let's have a more comprehensive look. Starting looking straight at it. Well, the turret, as you can see, and the mantlet, that is all hugely thick and ricochet territory because it's nicely rounded. The roof part, if you're on your gun is level with them, well, there are some weak spots, but they're all such very, very shallow angles, you get automatic ricochets. Hatch, well, that is thin, but it is weak, but it's such a small target. When you're shooting level, you're either going to miss it or ricochet or hit the front mantlet. Start looking down on it, though, from a bit higher ground, taller tank, 40 mil, but an automatic ricochet until you can look further down on it, and then it's penetration heaven. Hull wise, level at it, pointing straight at the front. That's all quite thick, equivalent. So hard to get through with your regular ammo or even your APCR. Hesh though, Hesh sort of loves this sort of stuff. When it's just thin armour, it just splats on there. The angle doesn't matter, it's hit anyway, and then its pace goes off and boom, straight through the thin armour. Driver's hatch, that's nice and thin, but very shallowly angled. And we're looking at automatic ricochets, unless you overpower the armour and dig in with your APCR. So as soon as you start looking down on the tank, yeah, gunner's hatch is the place to go. If you're thinking about its lower hull armour and it's exposed, well, it's actually pretty well angled. You can see the equivalent is pretty good, and as soon as you start getting closer to the tank, of course, you're probably taller, so that means you start looking down on it, it gets even thicker for the equivalent of her. So don't shoot the lower hull unless you're actually below it or a long way off and he's coming over a crest. Then it's a good place to shoot. Looking at the side, it's actually either spaced armour, though it's thin, there's spaced armour, and you can also see, there you go, the usual part where you want to shoot someone just above the tracks in the side, that's all heavily angled. It's got spaced armour and it's also heavily angled, so not a great place to hit. However, between the tracks, that's thin and it's flat, but the tracks help gear, well, they'll take the damage, and then they also give equivalent armour. So if you're willing to shoot the tracks off first, then the lower hull on the side is a good place to go. But there's also, if he's not turned his turret towards you and you're shooting that in the side, that top part of the turret is thin and it's not so greatly angled coming at it from the side. So I would, if you're hitting it at the side, if you've got side profile, shoot the top part of the turret. Rear, well, that's all thin, so if you can shoot in the back of the head or in the arse, that's great. Artillery view, or the front, well, it's all slopey and equivalent armour, but roof, engine deck, lovely, nice and thin, no problems. So, there you have it. T-10. Driver's hatch if you're above him. Flat on the cheek if you're not. If you're taking his tracks off. Lower hull. If you haven't, upper turret on the side. Well, goodbye for now and happy tanking.